The land that never forgets. There are places on this earth where time doesn't heal, where the cold doesn't just freeze your breath, but preserves every whisper, every scream, every last word spoken in desperation. Alaska is one of those places. Picture, if you will, an endless expanse of white stretching beyond the horizon. A land so vast that entire towns can vanish beneath the snow and not be found for decades. Where the wind carries voices from the past, and the ice holds memories like amber holds insects, perfectly preserved, waiting. The stories you're about to hear aren't folklore passed down through generations. They aren't campfire tales meant to frighten children. These are records, testimonies, scars carved into the very landscape of America's last frontier. Each one documented, each one witnessed, each one true. In Alaska, the dead don't rest. They wait. They watch. And sometimes, they remember your name. Tonight, we venture into 8 small towns scattered across this frozen wilderness. 8 communities where something went wrong, where the natural order bent and twisted into something else entirely. Where ordinary people encountered the impossible and lived to tell about it, if they were lucky enough to survive at all. But I warn you now. Alaska doesn't forget. And after tonight, neither will you. Story 1: The lighthouse that kept the lights on ***. Port Clarence sits at the edge of nowhere, a weathered settlement clinging to Alaska's western coast like a barnacle on a ship's hull. In 1979, it was little more than a collection of buildings huddled against the Bering Sea's endless fury. But for nearly 4 decades, Port Clarence had been home to something that defied explanation, something that refused to die. The lighthouse had been abandoned since 1943. Built in 1901 to guide ships through the treacherous waters of the Bering Strait, it had served faithfully through 2 world wars, countless storms, and the long, dark winters that could break a man's spirit as easily as the ice could crush his ship. The last keeper was a man named Thomas Brennan. Weather records show he transmitted his final report on November 15, 1943. Temperature, -37 degrees. Wind, northwest at 45 knots. Visibility, 0. Then, silence. When the Coast Guard finally reached the lighthouse 3 days later, they found the door unlocked, the radio still warm, and Thomas Brennan's coffee cup sitting on his desk, steam still rising from the surface. But Thomas himself was gone. No footprints in the snow. No signs of struggle. Just, gone. The lighthouse was sealed and forgotten. For 36 years, it stood empty against the Arctic wind, its light dark, its purpose served. But lighthouses, you see, aren't just buildings. They're beacons. And some beacons refuse to be extinguished. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb led the team that reopened Port Clarence Light in the spring of 1979. The Coast Guard had decided to reactivate several abandoned stations as part of an expanded maritime safety program. Webb's job was simple: restore power, test the equipment, and get the light operational again. What he found inside defied every rational explanation. The lighthouse was exactly as it had been left in 1943. Brennan's logbooks lay open on the desk, his handwriting still sharp and clear. His coat hung on its hook by the door. His bed was made with military precision. Even his razor sat beside a basin of water that, impossibly, had never frozen despite 36 years of sub-zero temperatures. But it was the light itself that made Webb's blood run cold. Every night at exactly 9:47 p.m., the lighthouse beam would ignite. Not the new bulb Webb's team had installed, but the original lens assembly, the one that hadn't been connected to any power source since 1943. The beam would sweep across the dark water for exactly 3 hours and 13 minutes, then fade to black. Webb documented everything. Temperature readings, electrical measurements, photographs. None of it made sense. The old wiring had long since corroded. The backup generators hadn't run in decades. Yet every night, like clockwork, that light blazed across the Bering Sea. On the 3rd night, Webb positioned himself in the lamp room to observe the phenomenon firsthand. At 9:46 p.m., he felt the temperature drop 10 degrees in as many seconds. His breath misted in the suddenly frigid air. The lighthouse groaned around him, metal contracting, wood settling, as if the entire structure was waking from a long sleep. Then, at exactly 9:47, the light erupted to life. But Webb wasn't alone in that lamp room. Standing beside the lens, as solid and real as Webb himself, was a man in a 1940s Coast Guard uniform. Tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that reflected the lighthouse beam like mirrors. The man didn't acknowledge Webb's presence. Instead, he reached for a radio microphone that materialized in his hands, pressed the transmission key, and spoke in a voice as clear as yesterday. Coast Guard Station Port Clarence to all vessels. Weather update follows. Temperature -37 degrees. Wind northwest at 45 knots. Visibility 0. Advise extreme caution in approaches to Bering Strait. Repeat, advise extreme caution. The transmission lasted exactly 3 minutes. Then the figure faded, leaving Webb alone with the blazing light and the impossible reality of what he'd just witnessed. Webb's report was classified immediately. The lighthouse was sealed again, its mysteries buried in government files marked unexplained phenomena, restricted access. But the locals in Port Clarence knew the truth. They'd known it for decades. Thomas Brennan never left his post. Through 36 years of abandonment, through decades of howling Arctic storms, through the long darkness of countless winters, he remained at his station. Still broadcasting. Still warning ships of dangers only he could see. And on nights when the Bering Sea grows angry, when storms roll in from the Russian coast, the fishermen of Port Clarence report the same thing their fathers and grandfathers reported before them, a light burning in the abandoned lighthouse, sweeping across waters that claimed so many souls. A guardian's vigil that will never end. The lighthouse keeper's final duty, to guide the living away from the waters where the dead still sail. Some say on the clearest nights, you can still hear Thomas Brennan's voice crackling through the static of marine radios, delivering weather reports that are always accurate, always urgent, always exactly 36 years too late. Warning vessels of storms that have already passed, or perhaps, storms that are yet to come. In Alaska, time doesn't move forward. It circles back on itself, like the beam of a lighthouse cutting through the eternal dark. Story 2: The Teacher Who Stayed Behind ***. The town of Teller, Alaska, population 247, sits on the edge of the world like a question mark punctuating the end of a sentence no one wants to finish. In the winter of 1987, that question would finally demand an answer. Eleanor Vasquez had been teaching at Teller Elementary for 3 years when the incident occurred. The children loved her. Parents respected her. In a community where teachers rarely lasted more than a single harsh winter, Eleanor had become something precious, something permanent. She was the kind of teacher who stayed late to help struggling students, who brought her own books from home when the school library ran short, who never missed a day despite Alaska's best efforts to keep her away. Even when the temperatures dropped to 40 below, even when the wind screamed across the tundra like banshees, Eleanor Vasquez was at her post. December 14, 1987, started like any other winter day in Teller. The temperature was a bitter -32 degrees. The wind was howling off the Bering Sea at 35 knots. Visibility was less than 50 feet. Just another Tuesday in paradise. At 2:15 p.m., Principal Robert Hayes initiated a routine winter evacuation drill. These drills were standard practice in Arctic communities, designed to prepare students and staff for the very real possibility of having to abandon the building during extreme weather emergencies. Boiler failures, power outages, structural damage from ice buildup, any number of things could make a school uninhabitable in minutes. The drill was simple: students and staff would evacuate to the gymnasium, where emergency supplies were stored. They would remain there for 15 minutes, then return to their classrooms. Standard procedure. Nothing out of the ordinary. Eleanor's third-grade class consisted of 18 students, ages 8 to 10. When the evacuation alarm sounded, she calmly instructed her children to form a line, just as they'd practiced. No running. No pushing. Stay together. Follow the buddy system. The gymnasium was only 60 feet from Eleanor's classroom. A straight shot down the main hallway, through 2 sets of double doors. In good weather, the walk took less than 2 minutes. But this wasn't good weather. The moment they stepped into the hallway, the building's heating system failed. The temperature inside began dropping immediately. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main power grid struggled to compensate. Through the windows, the children could see nothing but swirling white. The storm had intensified, turning the afternoon into a premature twilight. Other classes were already moving through the hallways, a procession of small figures bundled in winter coats, guided by their teachers' steady voices. Eleanor counted her students again. 18. All present and accounted for. They were halfway to the gymnasium when 8-year-old Amy Kivalina stumbled and fell. The little girl had been fighting a fever all week, but her parents couldn't afford to miss work, so they'd sent her to school anyway. Now, weakened by illness and disoriented by the building's sudden darkness, she crumpled to the floor. Eleanor immediately stopped the line and knelt beside Amy. The child was barely conscious, her lips blue with cold, her breathing shallow and rapid. Hypothermia was setting in fast. Stay together, Eleanor called to her remaining 17 students. Don't move from this spot. She gathered Amy in her arms and looked toward the gymnasium. The other classes had already reached safety. The hallway was empty except for Eleanor's group. Through the swirling snow visible through the windows, she could see that the storm was worsening by the minute. That's when she made the decision that would define her legacy in Teller, Alaska. Listen to me, she told her students, her voice calm despite the growing emergency. I'm going to take Amy to the nurse's office. It's closer than the gymnasium, and she needs help right now. I want all of you to continue to the gym. Follow the hallway, through the double doors, just like we practiced. Mrs. Henderson will be waiting for you. 9-year-old Daniel Ayatungguk, Eleanor's student helper, stepped forward. We should stay together, Mrs. Vasquez. That's the rule. Eleanor smiled, even as her breath misted in the rapidly cooling air. You're right, Daniel. That is the rule. But sometimes, grown-ups have to break rules to help people. You're the line leader now. Take care of everyone. She handed Daniel her flashlight and watched as he led the group toward the gymnasium. 17 small figures disappearing into the building's growing darkness. She waited until she could no longer see their shadows, then turned toward the nurse's office with Amy in her arms. That was the last time anyone saw Eleanor Vasquez alive. When the drill ended 15 minutes later, Principal Hayes took attendance in the gymnasium. 17 students from Eleanor's class were present and accounted for. Amy Kivalina was in the nurse's office, stable and warming up. But Eleanor herself was nowhere to be found. The search began immediately. Hayes organized teams to check every room, every closet, every possible space where Eleanor might have taken shelter. The heating system was restored within an hour, and the building's temperature returned to normal. But Eleanor had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. The police investigation found no evidence of foul play. Eleanor's car was still in the parking lot, covered with snow. Her purse was in her classroom desk drawer. Her coat was hanging on its hook by the door. Security cameras showed her entering the nurse's office with Amy at 2:32 p.m., but no footage of her leaving. The search expanded beyond the school. Volunteers combed the town, checking every building, every shelter, every place a person might seek refuge from the storm. The Coast Guard launched helicopters to search the surrounding tundra. Search dogs were brought in from Anchorage. Nothing. Eleanor Vasquez had simply disappeared. The school remained closed for a week while the investigation continued. When classes finally resumed, a substitute teacher took over Eleanor's third-grade class. The children were traumatized but coping. Counselors were brought in. The community rallied around the families. But on the first night after classes resumed, something impossible happened. At exactly 2:32 a.m., 12 hours to the minute after Eleanor's disappearance, night custodian Frank Jules saw lights in Eleanor's empty classroom. Not the harsh fluorescence of the school's electrical system, but a warm, yellow glow, like candlelight or lamplight from an earlier era. Frank investigated immediately. The classroom door was locked, just as it had been since the incident. But through the window, he could see a figure moving inside. A woman in a long skirt and white blouse, the kind of outfit Eleanor often wore. She was standing at the blackboard, writing something in careful, precise handwriting. Frank fumbled for his keys, but by the time he unlocked the door and switched on the lights, the classroom was empty. The blackboard was clean. The desks were arranged exactly as they'd been left. But the air was warm, as if someone had been breathing in that space moments before. The next morning, several students reported hearing their names called in the hallway, spoken in Mrs. Vasquez's familiar voice. Teachers found doors they'd locked standing slightly ajar. Books appeared on students' desks, open to exactly the pages they needed for their assignments. As the weeks passed, the phenomena intensified. Children claimed to see Eleanor's silhouette pacing past the classroom windows during recess, humming the lullaby she used to sing during quiet time, a melody none of them could name, but all of them remembered. Security cameras captured unexplained shadows moving through the hallways after hours. The motion sensors in Eleanor's classroom triggered randomly, always. At 2:32 a.m. the school board voted to seal Eleanor's classroom permanently. They moved her students to a different room, removed all of her personal belongings, and posted official notices that the space was off-limits to students and staff. But they couldn't seal away the truth. For months afterward, people reported seeing Eleanor Vasquez in the windows of the abandoned classroom. Always at dusk, when the light outside grew dim and uncertain. Always writing something on the blackboard that no one could quite make out. Always humming that same nameless lullaby. The children who had been in her class began having the same dream. They would find themselves back in Eleanor's classroom, sitting at their old desks, while she taught them lessons they couldn't quite remember upon waking. In the dreams, she looked exactly as she had in life, kind eyes, patient smile, chalk dust on her fingers from writing on the blackboard. But when they tried to read what she was writing, the words would shift and blur, like trying to focus on something underwater. The dreams continued for 3 years. Then, in the winter of 1990, the school board made the decision to demolish Teller Elementary and build a new facility on the other side of town. The old building was too expensive to maintain, they said. Too many problems with the heating system. Too many repairs needed. The demolition crew arrived on a bitter January morning when the temperature was 43 degrees below zero. They started with the main building, working systematically through each section. Eleanor's sealed classroom would be the last to go. But when they finally broke through the walls of that forbidden space, they found something that changed everything. Handprints. Dozens of them, pressed into the interior walls as if the plaster had been soft clay. Small handprints, child-sized, arranged in neat rows from floor to ceiling. The kind of prints children might leave if they were trying to find their way in the dark, using the walls for guidance. All of the prints were small, except for one. On the wall directly behind where Eleanor's desk had stood, they found a single adult handprint pressed deep into the plaster. The fingers were long and delicate, the palm narrow. The hand of a woman. Of a teacher. But this print was different from the others. While the children's handprints appeared to have been made in soft plaster, Eleanor's print was burned into the wall as if her hand had been red-hot when she pressed it there. The plaster around it was cracked and blackened, radiating outward like a spiderweb of char and ash. The demolition crew supervisor, a man named Carl Rutter who'd torn down buildings across Alaska for 20 years, would later tell reporters that he'd never seen anything like it. The handprint was so deep, so perfectly formed, that it looked as if someone had pressed their hand into the wall from the inside while the building was being constructed. But the building had been constructed in 1962. Eleanor Vasquez wasn't born until 1957. The new Teller Elementary opened in the fall of 1991. Modern heating system. State-of-the-art security. Bright, cheerful classrooms designed to inspire learning and growth. Everything the old school hadn't been. But on quiet winter evenings, when the wind howls across the tundra and the snow falls thick enough to muffle sound, the children of Teller still report hearing something impossible. A woman's voice, carried on the Arctic wind, calling their names with infinite patience and love. The voice of a teacher who never abandoned her post. Who stayed behind to make sure every child made it safely home. Even if home was somewhere she could never follow. In Alaska, some duties transcend death. Some responsibilities echo through eternity. And some teachers never really leave their classrooms, they just wait in the spaces between light and shadow, between memory and dream, ready to guide one more child through the darkness. Eleanor Vasquez kept her vigil for 17 students on December 14, 1987. The handprints on the wall suggest she may be keeping it still. Story 3: The Village That Answered Back ****. In the summer of 1994, the state of Alaska launched an ambitious project to connect its most remote communities with the outside world. The Rural Communications Initiative was designed to install emergency radio towers in villages so isolated that a medical emergency or natural disaster could claim lives simply because help couldn't be summoned in time. Dr. Sarah Chen led the technical team responsible for installing these towers. An MIT-trained engineer with a specialty in Arctic communications, she'd worked on similar projects in northern Canada and understood the unique challenges of maintaining technology in one of the world's harshest environments. The village of Kiana was their 7th installation. Located along the Kobuk River, 57 miles northeast of Kotzebue, Kiana was home to 388 people, mostly Inupiat Alaska natives who had lived along this stretch of river for thousands of years. The village had been without reliable outside communication for decades. Dr. Chen's team arrived in Kiana on July 15, 1994, via bush plane, their equipment and supplies loaded into every available space of the small aircraft. The installation was expected to take 3 days, day 1 to survey and prepare the site, day 2 to erect the tower and run the cables, day 3 to test the system and train local operators. The site they'd selected was a low hill overlooking the village, about a quarter-mile from the nearest house. The tower itself was a standard 150-foot steel lattice structure, designed to withstand winds up to 120 miles per hour and temperatures as low as 60 degrees below zero. Nothing fancy, nothing experimental. Just a reliable piece of equipment meant to save lives. The installation proceeded smoothly. By the evening of July 16, the tower was operational and broadcasting on the designated emergency frequencies. Test transmissions to Kotzebue, Fairbanks, and Anchorage came through clear and strong. The system was working perfectly. That night, Dr. Chen and her team were guests at a community dinner hosted by the village council. The people of Kiana were grateful for the new communication link, understanding better than most the isolation that defined their daily lives. Stories were shared of medical emergencies that had ended in tragedy simply because help couldn't be summoned, of supply flights that never arrived because weather conditions couldn't be reported, of families separated by storms that lasted for days without any way to confirm their loved ones' safety. The new radio tower would change all of that. Or so they thought. The first anomaly occurred at 2:17 a.m. on July 17. Dr. Chen was sleeping in her tent near the installation site when she was awakened by voices coming from the tower's base station radio. This shouldn't have been possible. The radio was set to monitor emergency frequencies only, and all traffic on those channels was strictly regulated. But the voices were there, clear as daylight, speaking in what sounded like Inupiaq, the local native language. Dr. Chen didn't understand the words, but the tone was conversational, almost casual, as if two friends were chatting about their day. She checked the equipment. Everything was functioning normally. The radio was receiving transmissions on the designated emergency frequency, 156.8 MHz. But according to her logs, no authorized stations were broadcasting on that frequency at this time of night. Dr. Chen made a note in her report and went back to sleep, assuming she'd picked up some kind of atmospheric anomaly, a signal bouncing off the ionosphere from somewhere else in Alaska, or perhaps interference from solar activity. But the next morning brought something that couldn't be explained so easily. Village elder Robert Sheldon approached Dr. Chen's camp with a concerned expression. Sheldon was in his 70s, a respected community leader who served as the unofficial liaison between Kiana and the outside world. "That radio tower of yours," he said without preamble, "it was talking last night." Dr. Chen nodded. "Yes, we were conducting some final tests." "Did the broadcasts disturb anyone?" Sheldon shook his head. "You don't understand. It wasn't broadcasting out. It was talking to us. To people in the village. People who've been dead for 20 years. Dr. Chen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic air. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sheldon, I don't follow." Sheldon gestured toward the village below. "My cousin Emma heard her husband's voice coming through her CB radio last night. Clear as day, speaking Inupiaq, calling her by the pet name he used to use. But Thomas died in 1987. Dr. Chen started to offer a rational explanation, but Sheldon continued. "Mary Tickett heard her son Jimmy asking about his hunting gear. But Jimmy drowned in the Kobuk River 3 summers ago. Alice Stone heard her mother singing the lullaby she used to sing when Alice was small. But Alice's mother died in 1974. The reports continued throughout the morning. Nearly a dozen village residents claimed to have heard voices of deceased family members coming through their radios, televisions, even electronic devices that weren't supposed to be capable of receiving radio transmissions. Dr. Chen documented everything, but her scientific mind searched for logical explanations. Electromagnetic interference. Atmospheric conditions. Mass hysteria brought on by the excitement of finally having modern communications. But then the tower began responding. That afternoon, while conducting final system tests, Dr. Chen attempted to contact the Coast Guard station in Kotzebue. She followed standard protocol. Identifying herself and her location, requesting a radio check to confirm signal strength and clarity. The response came immediately, but it wasn't from Kotzebue. "This is Thomas Sheldon, KL7XYZ, the voice said in accented English. Radio check received. Your signal is 5 by 5. Welcome to our home." Dr. Chen checked her frequency. She was broadcasting on the correct Coast Guard channel. But the call sign KL7XYZ wasn't assigned to any Coast Guard station. In fact, according to her database, that call sign hadn't been issued by the FCC at all. "Station identifying as KL7XYZ, please confirm your location and authorization for this frequency," Dr. Chen transmitted. The response chilled her blood. "This is Thomas Sheldon, broadcasting from Kiana, Alaska. Grid coordinate 66.9750 north, 160.4250 west. I've been waiting a long time to talk to my family." Dr. Chen looked at Robert Sheldon, who was standing nearby. The old man's face had gone pale. "That's my cousin Thomas," he whispered. "Those are his exact coordinates. His old homestead, where he used to have his ham radio set up. But Thomas has been dead for 7 years." Over the next several hours, the tower continued to broadcast voices that shouldn't exist. Former residents of Kiana, people who had died years or even decades earlier, speaking to their surviving family members with an intimacy that suggested they'd never left at all. Dr. Chen recorded everything. Hours of impossible conversations between the living and the dead, facilitated by 150 feet of steel and copper that somehow served as a bridge between worlds. The voices knew things they shouldn't know. They referenced recent events in the village, asked about grandchildren they'd never met, offered comfort to family members who were struggling with problems that had developed long after their deaths. But it was the technical analysis that truly disturbed Dr. Chen. The transmissions were coming from the tower itself. Not through it, not bouncing off it, but originating from the equipment her team had installed. The signal analysis showed that the voices were being generated by the tower's own broadcasting equipment, yet the voice patterns were too complex, too human, to be any kind of electronic interference or malfunction. On July 18, Dr. Chen made the decision to shut down the tower and investigate the equipment. What she found defied every principle of electrical engineering she'd learned in 20 years of professional experience. Inside the tower's primary transmission unit, wrapped around the copper wiring like ivy around a tree trunk, were thin strands of what appeared to be organic material. Hair, perhaps, or some kind of plant fiber. The strands were so fine they were almost invisible, but they covered every inch of the internal wiring. Dr. Chen carefully extracted a sample and examined it under a portable microscope. The fibers weren't plant material or animal hair. They appeared to be some kind of crystalline structure, translucent and faintly luminescent, unlike anything in her experience. But the most disturbing discovery came when she tried to remove the fibers from the wiring. The moment she cut the first strand, every radio in Kiana began broadcasting the same message simultaneously. "Don't take us away from our families. We've been waiting so long to come home." The voice was that of an elderly woman, speaking in heavily accented English. Several village residents identified it immediately as the voice of Anna Kiana, the village's namesake, who had died in 1962. Dr. Chen replaced the cut fiber and stepped away from the equipment. The broadcast stopped immediately. That evening, she called an emergency meeting with her team and the village council. The situation had moved far beyond the realm of technical malfunction or atmospheric anomaly. Something was using their radio tower to facilitate communication between the living and the dead. The question was, what should they do about it? The village was divided. Some residents were terrified by the supernatural communications and wanted the tower removed immediately. Others, particularly those who had heard from deceased loved ones, begged Dr. Chen to leave the equipment alone. "My grandmother has been trying to teach me the old songs," said Lucy Tickett, a young woman in her 20s. "Songs that were lost when she died. She says there are stories I need to know, traditions I need to preserve. How can I turn my back on that?" But Robert Sheldon voiced the concerns of the other faction. "This isn't natural. The dead should rest. We shouldn't be pulling them back into our world." Dr. Chen found herself in an impossible position. Her job was to install communication equipment that would save lives by connecting Kiana to emergency services. But the equipment she'd installed was connecting the village to something else entirely. On July 19, she made her decision. Working through the night, Dr. Chen and her team carefully dismantled the tower's transmission equipment. They documented every anomalous component, every strange fiber, every piece of evidence that suggested something beyond normal electromagnetic phenomena. The crystalline fibers were carefully preserved in sealed containers and shipped to laboratories in Anchorage and Seattle for analysis. The results, when they came back weeks later, only deepened the mystery. The fibers appeared to be organic in nature, but composed of elements that didn't occur naturally on Earth. Carbon isotopes that shouldn't exist. Trace minerals that had no known source. But the most disturbing discovery came after the tower was dismantled. The laboratory analysis revealed that the mysterious fibers contained genetic material. DNA sequences that, when cross-referenced with village records, matched exactly with the DNA profiles of every person whose voice had been heard through the radio broadcasts. People who had been dead for decades had somehow left traces of themselves in the copper wiring of a radio tower that hadn't existed during their lifetimes. Dr. Chen filed her final report with the Alaska Department of Transportation and marked it classification pending further review. The Kiana Radio Tower project was officially cancelled due to insurmountable technical difficulties. But the story didn't end there. In the years that followed, residents of Kiana continued to report strange phenomena. Voices speaking through electronic devices. Radio broadcasts that contained no source signal. Phones that rang with calls from numbers that had been disconnected decades earlier. And on clear nights, when the aurora borealis dances across the Arctic sky, some villagers claim they can still hear the voices of their ancestors carried on the wind, speaking words of love and guidance from a place that exists somewhere between memory and eternity. The radio tower was meant to connect Kiana to the outside world. Instead, it connected the village to something far more profound and mysterious, a communication network that spans not just distance, but time itself. In Alaska, the past is never truly past. It lives in the ice, in the wind, in the electromagnetic fields that dance around the aurora. And sometimes, with the right equipment and the right conditions, the voices of those who came before can still find a way to reach across the void and remind us that love transcends even death. The dead of Kiana had been waiting decades for someone to provide them with the technology to call home. Dr. Chen's radio tower gave them exactly what they needed. The question that haunts her still is whether she should have left it in place. Story for the cabin that walked away ****. Every hunter knows that the Alaskan wilderness can play tricks on you. Distances become meaningless when snow erases landmarks. Familiar trails vanish under winter's white blanket. Compass needles spin wildly near magnetic anomalies. What looks like solid ground can turn out to be a thin crust of ice over a bottomless lake. But even by Alaska's standards, what happened near Ejigik in the autumn of 1998 challenged every law of physics and reason. The Markowski brothers, Stan, Pete, and Joe, had been hunting the Bristol Bay region for over 15 years. Born and raised in Anchorage, they'd learned to read the wilderness the way other men read newspapers. They knew which ridges held the caribou herds, which valleys offered shelter from the wind, which streams ran clear enough to drink from even in late season. Every October, they'd fly their bush plane to a remote landing strip 30 miles northeast of Ejigik, set up their base camp, and spend 2 weeks pursuing moose and caribou across the tundra. It was a tradition that defined their year, a chance to escape the civilized world and reconnect with something primal and pure. The 1998 hunt started normally enough. Clear weather, good visibility, animal sign everywhere. They'd established their camp in a familiar spot, a sheltered valley with good drainage and protection from the worst of the Arctic wind. Their canvas wall tent was military surplus, built to withstand anything nature could throw at it. On their third day, while tracking a bull moose through a stand of stunted birch trees, Pete Markowski spotted something that shouldn't have been there. "Hey," he called to his brothers, pointing across a small meadow. "When did someone build a cabin out here?" Stan and Joe followed his gaze. There, nestled against a grove of spruce trees on the far side of the clearing, stood a log cabin. Nothing fancy, just 4 walls, a peaked roof, a single door, and 2 windows. The kind of basic shelter a trapper might build for overwintering in the bush. But the Markowski brothers had hunted this area for 15 years. They knew every ridge, every valley, every cluster of trees. There had never been a cabin in this meadow. "Must be new," Stan said, though even as he spoke the words, he didn't believe them. The logs looked weathered, seasoned by decades of harsh weather. The chinking between them was dark with age. This wasn't a new structure. Joe, the eldest brother and the most practical of the 3, pulled out his GPS unit and marked the coordinates. "Let's check it out. Maybe someone's in there." They approached the cabin cautiously. In the Alaska bush, you never knew who you might encounter or what kind of mood they might be in. Hermits, fugitives, and people who just wanted to be left alone all found their way to the wilderness eventually. But as they drew closer, it became apparent that the cabin was unoccupied. No smoke from the chimney. No tracks in the soft earth around the door. No signs of recent human activity. The door was unlocked. Inside, the cabin was furnished with the basic necessities of frontier life. A wood-burning stove. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs. Shelves lined with mason jars containing preserved vegetables and meat. A narrow bed against one wall, covered with wool blankets that smelled of wood smoke and thyme. Everything was clean, organized, and perfectly preserved, as if the occupant had just stepped out for a few minutes. But there was something unsettling about the scene. The preserved food in the jars was clearly decades old, the labels were faded and brittle, the contents darkened with age. Yet nothing had spoiled. No mold, no decay, no signs of deterioration. It was as if time had stopped the moment the cabin's owner walked out the door. Stan picked up a newspaper that lay folded beside the wood stove. The Anchorage Daily News, dated October 15, 1967. The headline read, "Alaska Pipeline Approved by Congress." The paper was yellowed with age but still perfectly readable. "This is getting weird," Pete muttered, examining a calendar on the wall. October 1967. The same month and year as the newspaper, but 31 years in the past. Joe was studying something else, fresh footprints in the dust that covered the cabin floor. Boot prints, size 10 or 11, leading from the door to the stove, then to the shelves, then back to the door. The prints were crisp and clear, as if they'd been made within the last few hours. But the dust around them was undisturbed, suggesting no one had walked through the cabin in years. The brothers spent 20 minutes exploring the cabin, documenting what they found, trying to make sense of the inconsistencies. Then they returned to their own camp to discuss what they'd discovered. "We'll GPS the location," Stan decided. "Mark it on our maps. Maybe do some research when we get back to town. Find out who owns this land, who might have built the cabin." But when they returned the next morning, the cabin wasn't there. The grove of spruce trees remained. The small meadow was unchanged. But the cabin had vanished as if it had never existed. No foundation. No cleared ground where it had stood. No trace that a structure had ever occupied that space. Joe checked his GPS coordinates 3 times. They were in exactly the right location. But the cabin was gone. "Maybe we were more turned around yesterday than we thought," Pete suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe it was in a different clearing." They spent the entire day searching. Every meadow, every grove of trees, every possible location where a cabin might stand. Nothing. The structure had disappeared completely. That night, around their campfire, the brothers tried to rationalize what they'd experienced. Fatigue, they decided. Wishful thinking. The mind playing tricks after too many days in the wilderness. They'd probably seen a stand of trees that looked like a cabin from a distance, then let their imaginations fill in the details. But on the 5th day of their hunt, they found the cabin again. This time, it was 3 miles northwest of their original sighting, situated in a different valley entirely. Same log construction, same weathered appearance, same unlocked door. Same perfectly preserved interior, complete with the 1967 newspaper and the mysterious footprints in the dust. But there were differences. The mason jars on the shelves were arranged in a different order. The wool blankets on the bed were folded more neatly. And there was something new on the rough-hewn table, a hand-drawn map showing the locations of game trails in the surrounding area, marked with dates from October 1998. This week. While the Markowski brothers had been hunting this same region, Joe studied the map carefully. The game trails were accurately marked. The dates corresponded to their own observations of animal movement patterns. Whoever had drawn this map was currently hunting the same area they were, tracking the same animals, following the same routes. But they hadn't encountered another hunter. No other plane had landed at the airstrip. No other camp had been visible from their daily reconnaissance flights. On the 6th day, they found the cabin again. Different location, same impossible characteristics. This time, it was only half a mile from their base camp, positioned on a hillside they'd climbed multiple times without seeing any structure. Stan had had enough. He was a methodical man, a retired engineer who believed in documentation and evidence. He spent 2 hours photographing the cabin from every angle, measuring its dimensions, recording GPS coordinates, and collecting samples of the aged wood. But when he tried to photograph the interior, his camera malfunctioned. The images came out distorted, showing strange shadows and shapes that hadn't been visible to the naked eye. Faces in the wood grain. Figures standing in corners where no one had been. That afternoon, they radioed their pilot in Ejigik and requested early pickup. They'd had enough hunting for 1 year. But their pilot, Charlie Morrison, had disturbing news when he arrived the next morning. "You boys see anything unusual out here?" he asked as they loaded their gear into the Cessna. "I've been getting weird reports from other hunters in this area. People claiming they've seen a cabin that moves around. Different location every time someone spots it." The Markowski brothers exchanged glances. "What kind of reports?" Joe asked. Charlie consulted a notepad he pulled from his shirt pocket. "Well, let's see. The Henderson party found a cabin 2 weeks ago, about 10 miles south of here. When they went back the next day to use it as a shelter during a storm, it was gone. The Williams group spotted one last week, but when they approached it, the thing seemed to move away from them. They followed it for 3 hours before giving up." He flipped a page in his notepad. "Most interesting report came from old Jake Sorensen. He's been hunting this region longer than anybody, knows every square mile like his own backyard. Jake claims he's been seeing the same cabin for 20 years, always in different locations, always exactly the same inside. Says he's left notes for the owner, but they're always gone when he comes back." Stan felt his mouth go dry. "What kind of notes?" "According to Jake, he's been trying to track down whoever owns the cabin, maybe offer to buy it or rent it during hunting season. Practical idea, having a permanent shelter out here would be worth its weight in gold. But he never gets any response. Just finds his notes gone and sometimes he finds notes left for him." Charlie closed his notepad and looked at the three brothers seriously. "Jake showed me one of the notes he found. Written in pencil on paper that looked like it came from an old schoolchild's tablet. Said, 'Welcome to my hunting grounds. Game trails marked on table map. Please respect the land and take only what you need. M. Patterson, October 1967. The name meant nothing to the Markowski brothers, but the date sent chills down their spines. During the flight back to Ejigik, Charlie shared more stories. Hunters who'd found the cabin stocked with supplies they desperately needed. Trappers who'd discovered it during blizzards that would have killed them otherwise. In every case, the cabin appeared exactly when and where it was most needed, then vanished once the crisis had passed. But it was the consistency of the reports that disturbed the brothers most. Same exterior appearance. Same interior layout. Same 1967 newspaper. Same mysterious footprints in the dust. As if the cabin existed in a perpetual state of October 1967, cycling endlessly through the wilderness like a ghost trapped in time. Back in Anchorage, Stan began researching the name M. Patterson. What he found in the state archives explained everything and nothing. Marcus Patterson, age 34, had been reported missing in October 1967 while on a solo hunting trip in the Bristol Bay region. He was an experienced outdoorsman, a carpenter by trade, who'd built his own cabin somewhere in the wilderness north of Ejigik. Search teams found his abandoned base camp but never located his permanent shelter. Patterson's body was never recovered. He was declared dead in absentia in 1970. But according to the missing person report, Patterson had been known for his unconventional hunting methods. He believed in minimal impact camping, taking only what he needed from the land, and leaving detailed maps and notes for other hunters who might benefit from his knowledge of the area. He'd also been working on an experimental cabin design, a modular structure that could be disassembled and moved to different locations depending on seasonal game migration patterns. Stan shared his research with his brothers, but none of them could explain how a missing hunter from 1967 could still be leaving current maps and notes in a cabin that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time and space. The following year, they returned to the same hunting area. On their second day, they found the cabin again. Same appearance, same interior, same impossibly preserved state. But this time, there was a new addition to the setup. On the table, beside the usual hand-drawn map of game trails, was a note written in the same pencil script they'd heard about from other hunters. "Welcome back, Markowski brothers. I've been watching your hunting patterns. You're respectful of the land and skilled trackers. The moose you're seeking is in the valley 2 miles northeast. Follow the creek bed. Good luck. M. Patterson, October 1999. Joe took the note and examined it carefully. The paper was the same aged, yellowed material they'd seen before. But the date was current. That afternoon, following the directions in Patterson's note, they found and successfully harvested the largest bull moose any of them had ever taken. The Markowski brothers continued hunting the Bristol Bay region for another 5 years before age and changing circumstances ended their annual tradition. In that time, they encountered Patterson's cabin 7 more times, always in different locations, always offering exactly the kind of help they needed most. Maps showing water sources during a dry year. Warnings about unstable ice conditions. Notes directing them away from areas where grizzly bears were active. Each interaction suggested an intelligence that was not only aware of their presence but actively working to ensure their safety and success. But it was their final encounter with the cabin that provided the most insight into the mystery. In October 2003, during what they knew would be their last hunt together, the brothers found the cabin positioned on a ridge overlooking their base camp. The interior was the same as always, but this time there was something different on the table. Beside the usual map and note was an old photograph. Black and white, edges worn with age. It showed a man in his 30s standing beside a log cabin, rifle in hand, smiling at the camera. The cabin in the photograph was identical to the one they were sitting in. On the back of the photograph, in the same pencil script they'd grown to recognize, was written, Marcus Patterson, October 1967. First successful season at my new hunting cabin. God's country. Below that, in different handwriting, fresher, more recent, someone had added, thank you for keeping me company all these years. MP 2003 inch. Stan studied the photograph and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic air. The cabin in the picture was surrounded by the same grove of spruce trees where they'd first discovered it in 1998. But in the photograph, the trees were young, barely 10 feet tall. Those same trees were now over 30 feet high. The cabin had been returning to this grove for 36 years, waiting for its owner to come home from a hunting trip that had ended in tragedy decades ago. And somehow, Marcus Patterson was still there, still hunting, still helping other outdoorsmen navigate the wilderness he'd learned to call home. The Markowski brothers never spoke publicly about their experiences with the walking cabin. They understood that some stories are too strange to be believed, too personal to be shared with skeptics who would demand proof they couldn't provide. But other hunters in the Bristol Bay region continue to report similar encounters. A cabin that appears when it's most needed, disappears when the crisis has passed, and seems to be guided by an intelligence that understands the wilderness better than any living person. The locals have a name for it now, Patterson's Place. And the unwritten rule among ethical hunters is simple: if you find the cabin, use what you need, respect what you find, and leave a note of thanks. Because in Alaska, some debts transcend death. Some hospitality extends beyond the grave. And some hunters never really finish their last season, they just keep walking the same trails, season after season, helping fellow outdoorsmen find their way home. Marcus Patterson's cabin walks the wilderness still, a shelter that exists wherever it's needed most, guided by the spirit of a man who understood that the true measure of a hunter isn't what he takes from the land, but what he gives back to those who come after him. In the vast emptiness of the Alaskan bush, that's the kind of legacy that can last forever. Story 5: The Ice Miners of Candle Creek ***. Gold has a way of calling to men that defies rational explanation. It whispers promises of wealth and freedom, drawing prospectors to the most inhospitable places on earth with the relentless pull of gravity. In Alaska, that call has echoed for over a century, leading countless souls into the wilderness in pursuit of fortune, and sometimes, something far more mysterious. Candle Creek, located about 20 miles northeast of the town of Candle on the Seward Peninsula, had been worked sporadically by gold miners since the early 1900s. It wasn't one of the famous strikes that built boomtowns overnight, but it produced enough color to keep optimists coming back year after year, season after season, generation after generation. By 1994, most of the easily accessible gold had long since been extracted. The creek had been dredged, panned, and sluiced by dozens of operations over the decades. What remained were the harder claims, deposits that required heavy machinery, serious investment, and a willingness to dig deeper than anyone had dug before. That's what brought the Morrison Mining Company to Candle Creek in the summer of 1994. Frank Morrison was a third-generation Alaska miner who'd worked claims from the Klondike to the Aleutians. His grandfather had come north during the 1898 gold rush and never left. His father had mined the same claims during the Depression, pulling enough gold from the frozen earth to keep his family fed when the rest of the country was starving. Frank had inherited not just the family business, but the family obsession. He'd invested everything he owned in modern mining equipment, hydraulic excavators, mechanical sifters, and most importantly, steam-powered thawing equipment that could soften permafrost that had been frozen solid for thousands of years. His crew consisted of 5 men: Tommy Hendricks, the equipment operator; Dave Kowalski, the site supervisor; Miguel Santos, the mechanic; Bobby Teal, the general laborer; and Frank himself, who served as both owner and foreman. They established their camp on Candle Creek in mid-June, when the midnight sun provided 20 hours of working light and the ground had softened enough to allow their equipment to reach the claim site. The plan was simple: use the steam thawing equipment to soften the permafrost layer by layer, excavate the thawed material, and run it through their sifting operation to extract any gold that remained. It was backbreaking, expensive work, but Frank's geological surveys suggested there was a rich deposit about 15 feet below the surface, deeper than previous operations had been able to reach, but well within the capabilities of modern equipment. For the first month, everything proceeded according to plan. The thawing operation worked methodically through the permafrost, creating an excavation site roughly 40 feet square and 12 feet deep. They found modest amounts of gold in the thawed material, enough to cover their expenses and justify continuing the operation. But on July 18, 1994, Tommy Hendricks' excavator broke through the permafrost into something that shouldn't have existed. A cavity. A hollow space beneath the frozen ground, about 6 feet high and extending beyond the reach of their work lights. The walls of the cavity were smooth ice, polished to a mirror finish by some unknown process. And scattered across the floor of this underground chamber were mining tools. Pickaxes. Shovels. Hand-cranked sifting pans. A wheelbarrow with wooden wheels and iron fittings. All perfectly preserved in the sub-zero conditions, and all dating to an era decades before Frank Morrison's operation. But here's what made the discovery impossible: the tools were still warm. Not room temperature. Not merely unfrozen. Actually warm to the touch, as if they'd been used within the last few hours. Dave Kowalski was the first man to climb down into the cavity. He was an experienced miner, a practical man who'd seen plenty of strange things in 30 years of digging holes in the Alaska wilderness. But what he found in that ice chamber challenged everything he thought he knew about physics, geology, and the passage of time. The mining tools weren't just warm, they were actively steaming in the frigid air of the cavity. Condensation rose from their metal surfaces like smoke. When Dave picked up one of the pickaxes, the wooden handle was so warm it was almost uncomfortable to hold. But it was the condition of the tools that truly disturbed him. They weren't antiques preserved by cold and time. They showed signs of recent use. Fresh scratches on the metal. Sawdust and wood shavings around the handles that looked like they'd been made yesterday. Dirt and rock particles clinging to the working surfaces that matched the geological composition of Candle Creek. "Frank," Dave called up to the surface, his voice echoing strangely in the ice chamber. "You need to see this. Bring the camera." Frank descended into the cavity with a Polaroid camera and a flashlight. What he documented over the next hour would haunt him for the rest of his life. The ice chamber extended far beyond what their excavation had revealed. Following the beam of his flashlight, Frank could see that the cavity stretched into a network of tunnels, all carved from solid ice, all reflecting their lights like a hall of mirrors. And in every direction, scattered along the floor of the tunnels, were more mining tools. Hundreds of them. Pickaxes, shovels, pans, buckets, wheelbarrows. All warm to the touch. All showing signs of recent use. All arranged as if their owners had simply set them down and walked away moments before. But it was the sounds that made Frank's blood run cold. From somewhere deep in the tunnel network came the rhythmic sound of metal striking stone. The unmistakable noise of pickaxes working against hard rock. Steady, measured, purposeful. The sound of miners at work. Frank called out, his voice echoing through the ice tunnels, "Hello. Anyone down here?" The pickaxe sound stopped immediately. The silence that followed was absolute and oppressive, as if the very air was holding its breath. Then, from the deepest part of the tunnel system, came a response. "Who's that up there?" "Morrison, is that you?" The voice was distant but clear, speaking with the flat vowels of a Midwestern accent. An older man, by the sound of it. Someone who knew Frank's name. "This is Frank Morrison," Frank called back. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" "Morrison," the voice repeated, and this time Frank could hear the relief in it. "Thank God. We've been waiting for a Morrison to come back for so long. Your grandfather said you'd be along eventually." Frank felt the world tilt around him. His grandfather had died in 1987. But more importantly, his grandfather had never worked this particular claim. Frank had purchased the mineral rights to Candle Creek from a different family entirely. "Who is this?" Frank called again. "Come up where I can see you." "Can't do that," the voice replied. "We can't leave until the work is finished. Your grandfather's orders. But we sure would appreciate some help down here. This seam is richer than anything we've seen, but it's going to take more than the 6 of us to extract it properly." Frank counted on his fingers. His crew consisted of 5 men plus himself. 6 total. The same number the voice in the tunnels had mentioned. "How many of you are down there?" Frank asked. 6 of us, came the reply. Same as always. Tommy, Dave, Miguel, Bobby, Frank, and me. Been working this claim since your grandfather set us up down here. Must be, 15, 20 years now. Time gets a little fuzzy down here in the ice. Frank Morrison felt his knees go weak. The voice had just listed the names of his entire crew, names that would have been meaningless to anyone who wasn't directly involved in their current operation. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The voice had included Frank's own name in the list. As if he was already down in the tunnels, working alongside the phantom miners. Frank scrambled out of the ice chamber as quickly as he could manage and called an immediate work stoppage. He gathered his crew around the excavation site and tried to explain what he'd encountered, but the words sounded insane even to his own ears. Warm mining tools in a frozen cavity. Tunnels carved from solid ice. Voices calling his name from the darkness. It was the kind of story that got miners a reputation for cabin fever and too much solitary drinking. But Tommy Hendricks had heard the voices too. While operating his excavator near the cavity entrance, he'd heard multiple men talking, their voices carrying clearly through the ice tunnels. Conversations about work schedules, equipment maintenance, and pay grades. Normal mining talk, except it was coming from an abandoned tunnel system buried beneath decades of permafrost. Dave Kowalski admitted he'd felt compelled to climb down into the cavity, as if something had been calling to him personally. When he'd picked up that first warm pickaxe, he'd experienced a strange sense of familiarity, as if he'd held that exact tool many times before. Miguel Santos, the crew's mechanic, reported that several of their machines had been running differently since they'd broken through into the cavity. Smoother, more efficiently, as if they'd been recently serviced by an expert technician. But Miguel was the only mechanic on site, and he hadn't performed any maintenance work in over a week. That night, the crew held a meeting to decide how to proceed. The rational choice was obvious: fill in the cavity, abandon the claim, and move their operation to a different location. Whatever was happening at Candle Creek was beyond their understanding or control. But the gold changed everything. Bobby Teal had been examining the rock samples from the cavity walls. Mixed in with the ice were flakes of gold so pure and abundant that a single cubic foot of material would be worth thousands of dollars. The mysterious tunnel system had been carved through the richest gold deposit any of them had ever seen. The voices in the tunnels had been telling the truth. The scene was richer than anything they'd ever encountered. Rich enough to make them all wealthy men. Rich enough to justify working alongside whatever was already down there. Against every instinct of self-preservation, Frank Morrison made the decision to continue the operation. They would extract gold from the ice tunnels, but they would do it carefully, respectfully, and with constant attention to their own safety. Over the next 3 weeks, they developed a routine that seemed to satisfy both the living and the dead. Each morning, Frank's crew would lower themselves into the cavity and work the outer tunnels, extracting ice and rock that contained visible gold. They used only hand tools, out of respect for whatever presence was deeper in the tunnel system. The work was slow and labor-intensive, but the gold content was so high that they were pulling out more precious metal in a day than most operations found in a month. And every evening, as they prepared to leave the tunnels, they would hear the pickaxes start up again in the deeper chambers. Steady, rhythmic, tireless. The sound of miners who never needed to rest, never needed to eat, never needed to see daylight. Sometimes, the phantom miners would leave gifts for Frank's crew. Tools arranged by the cavity entrance, warm to the touch and perfectly maintained. Samples of rock that contained gold concentrations beyond anything the living miners had found on their own. Maps drawn in the ice, showing the layout of tunnel systems that extended for miles beneath the permafrost. But it was the gradual changes in Frank's crew that proved most disturbing. Tommy Hendricks began working longer hours, staying in the tunnels well past the end of the official workday. When asked about it, he claimed he'd lost track of time, but his fellow crew members reported hearing 2 excavators running simultaneously, Tommy's machine on the surface, and another identical excavator somewhere deep in the ice tunnels. Dave Kowalski started speaking in the flat Midwestern accent they'd heard from the voices in the tunnels. When confronted about it, he seemed genuinely surprised and claimed he was born and raised in Alaska. But Bobby Teal found a wallet in Dave's gear containing identification for a David Kowalski from Minnesota, ID that Dave swore he'd never seen before. Miguel Santos began performing maintenance on equipment that didn't exist. His work logs showed detailed service records for machines that weren't part of their operation, written in handwriting that was almost, but not quite, identical to his own. And Frank Morrison found himself staying later and later each day, drawn by the sound of voices calling his name from the deepest part of the tunnel system. Voices that sounded more familiar with each passing day, as if he'd been listening to them for years instead of weeks. On August 15, 1994, Frank made the decision to explore the deepest part of the tunnel system and confront whatever was calling to him. He descended into the cavity alone, following the ice tunnels deeper than any of his crew had ventured before. What he found in the heart of the tunnel system was a chamber carved from solid ice, illuminated by a warm, golden light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. 6 miners worked steadily in the chamber, extracting gold rich or with tools identical to the ones Frank's crew used on the surface. The miners looked exactly like Frank's crew. Tommy, Dave, Miguel, Bobby, and Frank himself, all working with the mechanical precision of men who'd been performing the same tasks for decades. But their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, and their movements had the repetitive quality of clockwork figures. At the center of the chamber, supervising the work, was an older man Frank recognized from family photographs. His grandfather. Dead for 7 years, but looking exactly as he had during his prime mining days in the 1960s. "There you are, Frank," his grandfather said without looking up from his work. "We've been waiting for you. Time to join the family business properly." Frank tried to speak, but found his voice had become the flat Midwestern accent he'd been hearing in the tunnels. When he looked down at his hands, they were holding tools he didn't remember picking up. Tools that were warm to the touch and felt familiar in his grip. "How long have I been down here?" Frank heard himself ask. "Time doesn't work the same way down here," his grandfather replied. "Could be minutes. Could be decades. Doesn't matter much when there's gold to be extracted." Frank looked around the chamber and realized that the golden light wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the gold itself, veins of precious metals so pure and concentrated that they glowed with their own inner fire. More gold than existed in all the mines of Alaska combined, waiting to be extracted by miners who would never grow tired, never grow old, never need to leave. But somewhere in the deepest part of his mind, Frank Morrison remembered sunlight. He remembered the warmth of summer air on his face, the taste of coffee around a morning campfire, the sound of birds singing in the brief Arctic spring. With an effort that felt like lifting the entire weight of the earth, Frank Morrison set down his tools and walked away from the richest gold deposit in human history. He climbed out of the ice tunnels and didn't stop until he reached the surface. There, he found his crew loading their equipment onto trucks, preparing to leave Candle Creek permanently. "How long was I down there?" Frank asked Tommy Hendricks. Tommy looked at him strangely. "Down where?" "You've been up here with us all morning, helping us pack up." Frank checked his watch. It was 10:30 a.m. He distinctly remembered descending into the tunnels just after sunrise, around 6 a.m. But his clothes weren't dirty, his hands weren't cold, and he had no memory of helping to pack anything. "Why are we leaving?" Frank asked. Dave Kowalski answered, "You don't remember? You gave the order 3 days ago. Said we'd extracted enough gold to make the operation profitable and it was time to move on to a different claim." Frank had no memory of giving such an order. But when he checked their extraction records, he found detailed logs showing they'd pulled nearly $200,000 worth of gold from the Candle Creek site, enough to make them all wealthy men. Gold that Frank had no memory of extracting. The Morrison Mining Company left Candle Creek on August 16, 1994. They sealed the excavation site and filed the appropriate paperwork with the State Mining Commission. Their official report described a successful operation that had extracted gold from previously inaccessible permafrost deposits using innovative steam thawing techniques. There was no mention of ice tunnels, phantom miners, or warm tools in frozen chambers. But Frank Morrison never worked another mining claim. He sold his equipment, disbanded his company, and moved to Anchorage, where he invested his share of the Candle Creek gold in a small construction business. He never spoke publicly about what he'd experienced in the ice tunnels beneath the creek. His crew members went their separate ways. Tommy Hendricks moved to Washington State and became a long-haul trucker. Dave Kowalski returned to his hometown in Minnesota and opened a hardware store. Miguel Santos started a successful auto repair shop in Fairbanks. Bobby Teal used his mining proceeds to buy a fishing boat and never set foot on dry land longer than necessary. None of them stayed in touch. None of them discussed what had happened at Candle Creek. It was as if they'd made an unspoken agreement to forget everything about that summer and move on with their lives. But in the years that followed, other mining operations reported similar discoveries in the same region. Warm tools in frozen ground. Voices calling from abandoned tunnels. The sound of pickaxes working in chambers that contained no living miners. And sometimes, late at night, Frank Morrison would wake from dreams of golden light and the sound of his grandfather's voice calling his name from somewhere deep beneath the ice. Dreams that felt more like memories, as if part of him had never really left those tunnels at all. In Alaska, some gold is too rich to mine safely. Some deposits come with a price that can't be measured in dollars and cents. And some family businesses span generations in ways that transcend the boundaries between life and death. The Candle Creek claim remains abandoned to this day. But local miners report that on quiet nights, when the aurora borealis dances across the Arctic sky, you can still hear the sound of pickaxes working deep beneath the permafrost. The sound of miners who found a deposit so rich they could never bring themselves to leave it behind. Gold calls to men in ways that defy rational explanation. But sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you can hear it calling back from somewhere beyond the edge of the living world. The Morrison family gold mine is still operational. It just operates in a place where time moves differently, where miners never age, and where the richest deposits wait patiently for the next generation to answer the call. Frank Morrison's grandfather is still supervising the work, still waiting for his family to join him in the tunnels beneath Candle Creek, where the gold glows with its own inner fire and the mining never ends. Story 6: The Last Broadcast from Kotlik. In the vast emptiness of western Alaska, radio waves carry more than just voices, they carry hope. For the isolated communities scattered across the tundra, a local radio station isn't just entertainment, it's a lifeline connecting neighbors separated by miles of wilderness, a source of weather warnings that can mean the difference between life and death, and sometimes the only human voice that stands between sanity and the crushing solitude of the Arctic dark. KCTK 89.7 FM served the village of Kotlik and the surrounding Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta from a small broadcast studio that doubled as the community center's back office. The station ran on a shoestring budget, volunteer staff, and the determination of one woman who understood that in Alaska, communication isn't a luxury, it's survival. Sarah Kameroff had been KCTK's primary broadcaster since 1979. Born and raised in Kotlik, she'd attended college in Anchorage with dreams of working for a major city radio station, but family obligations and a deep love for her community brought her home to the village where 3 generations of her family had lived, fished, and raised their children. Sarah's show, Evening Voices, aired Monday through Friday from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. It was a mix of local news, weather updates, community messages, and music chosen to keep night shift workers company and help insomniacs pass the long hours until dawn. Sarah had a warm, conversational style that made listeners feel like they were chatting with a trusted friend rather than listening to a radio program. But it was her dedication to emergency broadcasting that made Sarah invaluable to the communities within KCTK's broadcast range. When storms rolled in from the Bering Sea, when hunters went missing on the tundra, when medical emergencies required evacuation flights that couldn't land in bad weather, Sarah stayed at her microphone, coordinating rescue efforts and keeping families informed. She'd saved lives with her broadcasts, guided lost travelers to safety, relayed medical instructions from Anchorage doctors to village health workers, connected worried families with loved ones stranded by weather or equipment failures. In October 1982, Sarah was preparing for what she expected to be a routine broadcast. The weather was typical for late autumn, temperatures in the teens, moderate wind, scattered snow showers that would either blow over or develop into a more serious storm system. Nothing unusual by Western Alaska standards. The evening started normally. Sarah arrived at the station at 9:30 p.m., reviewed her notes for the night's programming, and tested her equipment. Everything was functioning properly. The transmitter was operating at full power. The telephone lines were clear. The weather monitoring equipment was providing accurate readings. At exactly 10 p.m., Sarah went live with her opening segment. Good evening, everyone. This is Sarah Kameroff with Evening Voices on KCTK 89.7 FM, broadcasting from Kotlik to all our friends and neighbors across the Delta. It's October 15, 1982, and we're looking at partly cloudy skies with temperatures holding steady around 16 degrees. Wind is light and variable, and it looks like we're in for a quiet night. For the first hour, everything proceeded normally. Sarah read community announcements, played music requests, and provided weather updates. She took phone calls from listeners who wanted to send messages to family members in other villages, a regular feature of Evening Voices that helped maintain connections across the scattered communities. At 11:15 p.m., she received a call from Martha Beans in the neighboring village of Emmamak. Sarah, Martha said, her voice tight with worry, have you heard anything about strange lights over the river tonight? Sarah checked her notes. No reports of aircraft in the area, no unusual weather phenomena. What kind of lights, Martha? My husband was checking our fish nets just after dark, and he saw lights moving along the riverbank. Not like flashlights or snowmobiles. More like balls of fire, rolling through the grass. He counted at least 6 of them, all moving in the same direction, heading downriver toward Kotlik. Sarah made a note to mention the report on air and ask if anyone else had seen similar phenomena. Ball lightning wasn't uncommon in Alaska, and sometimes the aurora borealis could create unusual ground-level light effects. But over the next 30 minutes, Sarah received 7 more calls reporting the same thing. Lights moving along the Yukon River, all heading toward Kotlik. All described the same way, balls of fire rolling across the landscape like tumbleweeds made of light. At 11:50 p.m., Sarah decided to step outside the broadcast studio and look for herself. The moment she opened the door, she knew something was wrong. The air outside was dead still. Not the usual Arctic wind, not even a gentle breeze. The kind of absolute stillness that made sounds carry for miles and left footprints perfectly preserved in the snow. But more disturbing than the stillness was the silence. No dogs barking. No snowmobiles in the distance. No generators humming. No sounds of human activity at all. The village of Kotlik, population 386, sounded like a ghost town. And then Sarah saw the lights. 6 spheres of golden fire, each about the size of a basketball, rolling slowly along the riverbank toward the village. They moved with purpose, maintaining perfect formation, leaving no trace in the snow behind them. As they drew closer, Sarah could see that they weren't simply balls of light, they contained shapes, figures, shadows that moved and gestured as if the lights were windows into some other world. Sarah went back inside and returned to her microphone. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady despite the growing sense of unreality. "This is Evening Voices, and I'm standing outside our studio here in Kotlik, watching some very unusual atmospheric phenomena moving along the river. 6 lights, perfectly round, moving in formation toward the village. I want to assure everyone that there's no immediate danger, but I'm going to stay on the air and continue monitoring the situation." She played a 15-minute block of music while she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The lights had reached the village's outskirts and were moving between the houses, pausing at each building as if inspecting them. Through her studio window, Sarah could see that wherever the lights passed, the electrical systems in the houses flickered and dimmed. At 12:15 a.m., the lights reached the community center where KCTK's studio was located. Sarah watched through her window as one of the spheres approached the building. Up close, she could see that the figure inside the light was human, or had been human. An elderly native woman, dressed in traditional clothing, with intricate facial tattoos that marked her as someone from an earlier era. The woman looked directly at Sarah through the studio window and pressed her hand against the glass. The moment the figure touched the window, every piece of electronic equipment in the studio began malfunctioning. The transmitter's power fluctuated wildly. The telephone lines crackled with static. The weather monitoring instruments started displaying impossible readings, temperatures in the hundreds of degrees, wind speeds that would level mountains, barometric pressure readings that suggested conditions that couldn't exist on Earth. But the microphone continued working. And Sarah Kamarov continued broadcasting. "I'm not sure what's happening here," she said, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. "Our equipment is experiencing some kind of interference, but I want everyone listening to know that I'm safe and the station is still operational. If you're seeing similar phenomena in your area, please stay indoors and remain calm." The figure outside the window was speaking, but Sarah couldn't hear her voice through the glass. Instead, the woman seemed to be mouthing words, repeating the same phrase over and over with increasing urgency. Sarah tried to read the woman's lips, but the traditional facial tattoos made it difficult to make out the exact words. It looked like she was saying, "They're coming," or "We're coming," or possibly, "You're coming." At 12:30 a.m., all 6 lights converged on the community center. Sarah could see figures in each of them now, men, women, and children, all dressed in traditional native clothing, all appearing to be from an earlier historical period. They surrounded the building, pressing their hands against the windows, their mouths moving in what appeared to be urgent conversation. That's when Sarah realized she could hear them. Not through the windows or the walls, but through her headphones. The figures' voices were coming through the radio equipment, mixing with her broadcast signal, creating an overlay of sound that was both disturbing and strangely beautiful. They were speaking in Yupik, the traditional language of the region, but Sarah could understand every word despite her limited knowledge of the language. They were warning her about something. Telling her to prepare. Explaining that she had been chosen to serve as a bridge between worlds. The time of crossing approaches, the elderly woman's voice said through Sarah's headphones. The boundaries grow thin. You must help us warn them. Warn them about what? Sarah asked, speaking into her microphone and somehow knowing the figures could hear her. The cold that comes before the end, another voice replied, this one belonging to a young man with traditional hunter's tattoos. The darkness that swallows light. The silence that follows the last breath. Sarah felt ice forming in her veins, but she continued broadcasting. This was what she did, she kept people informed, no matter how strange or frightening the information might be. I'm receiving some kind of transmission, she told her listeners. Voices speaking in Yupik, warning about. I'm not entirely sure. Some kind of danger approaching our area. If anyone else is receiving similar transmissions, please call the station. But her telephone had stopped working. The lines were dead, filled with a static that sounded like whispered conversations in languages she didn't recognize. At 1 a.m., something extraordinary happened. Sarah's broadcast signal, normally limited to a range of about 50 miles, suddenly expanded across the entire state of Alaska. Radio operators in Anchorage, Fairbanks, Nome, and Juneau began reporting that they were receiving KCTK's signal with perfect clarity, despite being hundreds of miles outside the station's normal broadcast range. And they were all hearing the same thing, Sarah Kamaroff's voice, calm and professional, describing the impossible scene unfolding around her. The figures are communicating more urgently now, Sarah reported. They seem to be trying to warn us about some kind of environmental catastrophe. Changes in weather patterns, disruptions in wildlife behavior, something they call the long darkness approaching from the north. As she spoke, the figures outside the studio began to fade, their lights growing dimmer and less distinct. But their voices in Sarah's headphones grew louder and more insistent. Tell them to prepare, the elderly woman's voice commanded. Tell them to gather their families, store their food, strengthen their shelters. The old ways will return. The new ways will fail. Sarah dutifully relayed these messages to her listeners, even as she wondered if she was losing her mind. But the professionalism that had carried her through thousands of hours of broadcasting kept her voice steady and her reporting accurate. At 1:30 a.m., the lights began moving away from the community center, heading back toward the river. But as they departed, they left something behind, a warmth in the studio that had nothing to do with the heating system, and a sense of presence that suggested Sarah was no longer alone. They're leaving now, she reported. The lights are moving back toward the river, heading upstream. But I want to assure everyone that whatever just happened here wasn't threatening. If anything, it felt like a warning from people who care about our well-being. For the next 30 minutes, Sarah continued her broadcast normally, playing music and providing weather updates as if nothing unusual had occurred. But listeners across Alaska reported that her voice had taken on a different quality, richer, more resonant, as if she were speaking from a much larger space than the small studio in Kotlik. At exactly 2 a.m., Sarah concluded her program with her usual sign-off. This is Sarah Kamaroff saying goodnight from all of us here at Evening Voices on KCTK 89.7 FM. Remember to keep your families close, your doors unlocked for neighbors in need, and your hearts open to the voices that call from the darkness. We'll be back tomorrow night with more music, more news, and more of the conversations that keep our communities connected across this beautiful, mysterious land we call home. She switched off her microphone, began the overnight automated programming, and started cleaning up her notes for the night's broadcast. That was the last time anyone saw Sarah Kamaroff alive. The next morning, KCTK's volunteer maintenance supervisor, Paul Atchik, arrived at the community center to perform routine equipment checks. He found the studio door unlocked, the lights on, and all the broadcast equipment running normally. But Sarah was nowhere to be found. Her car was in the parking lot. Her purse was in her desk drawer. Her coat was hanging on its hook by the door. The coffee she'd made during her 1 a.m. break was still warm in its cup. But Sarah herself had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. The search for Sarah Kameroff lasted 3 weeks and involved volunteers from every village within a 100-mile radius. Search and rescue teams combed the tundra around Kotlik. Divers checked the river. Aircraft searched from the air. Search dogs were brought in from Anchorage. No trace of Sarah was ever found. But that wasn't the strangest part of the story. 3 days after Sarah's disappearance, KCTK's automated equipment began broadcasting something that shouldn't have been possible. At exactly 2 a.m. on October 18, 1982, Sarah Kameroff's voice returned to the airwaves. "This is Sarah Kameroff with a special broadcast from Evening Voices," her familiar voice said through radio speakers across western Alaska. "I want everyone to know that I'm safe, and I want to share some important information about the warnings we received 3 nights ago." The broadcast lasted exactly 1 hour. Sarah's voice, unmistakably real and present, described in detail the environmental changes that were approaching Alaska. Unusual weather patterns that would develop over the coming decade. Shifts in wildlife migration routes that would affect subsistence hunting. Changes in sea ice formation that would impact coastal communities. Every prediction Sarah made in that impossible broadcast proved accurate over the following years. But it was the personal messages that convinced listeners this wasn't some kind of elaborate hoax or technical malfunction. Martha Beans in Emmamak, Sarah's voice said during the broadcast, "Your husband's nets are positioned perfectly for the king salmon run that's coming early this year. Don't move them, despite what the old-timers are telling you." Paul Achik, "Thank you for taking care of the station equipment. There's a spare transmitter tube in the supply closet behind the extra batteries. You're going to need it next month. To my sister Janet in Anchorage, tell Mom that I'm fine and I'm exactly where I need to be. The voices that called me home weren't taking me away, they were bringing me to where I can help the most people." The broadcast ended at exactly 3 a.m., and KCTK returned to its normal automated programming. These impossible broadcasts continued for the next 5 years. Always at 2 a.m. Always lasting exactly 1 hour. Always containing information that proved valuable to the communities within the station's range. Weather warnings that saved lives. Hunting and fishing advice that helped families through difficult seasons. Personal messages that provided comfort to people struggling with loss or isolation. Sarah Kameroff continued serving her community from whatever dimension she'd been called to, using the radio waves to bridge the gap between the living and the disappeared. The broadcast stopped in 1987, but KCTK's listeners never forgot Sarah's final service to the communities she loved. Her predictions about environmental changes helped villages prepare for the shifting conditions that would define life in Alaska over the next several decades. Her warnings about wildlife pattern changes allowed hunters and fishermen to adapt their strategies. Her messages of hope and connection sustained people through some of the hardest winters in living memory. In 1990, KCTK was forced to cease operations due to budget constraints and equipment failures. The community center was converted to other uses, and the broadcast studio was dismantled. But on quiet nights, when atmospheric conditions are just right, radio operators across western Alaska report picking up a familiar signal on 89.7 FM, Sarah Kameroff's voice, broadcasting from a station that no longer exists, sharing news and music and the kind of warm, professional companionship that made Evening Voices more than just a radio program. She's still out there, somewhere between the radio waves and the aurora borealis, keeping her vigil over the communities that shaped her life and claimed her loyalty. In Alaska, some broadcasts never really end. They just find new ways to reach the people who need to hear them. And sometimes, late at night when the world feels too big and too empty, you can still tune in to Evening Voices and hear Sarah Kameroff reminding you that no matter how isolated you might feel, you're never really alone. The voices that call from the darkness are often the voices that love us most. Story 7, The Fog over St. Paul Island ***. The Bering Sea has moods like a living thing. It can be mirror calm 1 hour and murderous the next, shifting from deceptive tranquility to towering waves and howling wind with no warning beyond the subtle changes in air pressure that experienced fishermen learn to read like scripture. But even by Bering Sea standards, the fog that began appearing around St. Paul Island in the autumn of 1983 was unlike anything the local fishing fleet had ever encountered. St. Paul Island sits in the middle of the Bering Sea like a stepping stone between Alaska and Russia, home to the largest fur seal colony in the world and a small community of fishermen who've learned to make their living from one of the planet's most dangerous waters. The island's position makes it a natural waypoint for fishing vessels working the rich waters of the Bering Sea, and its harbor provides one of the few safe refuges when the weather turns deadly. Captain Jimmy Kalayuk had been fishing these waters for 23 years when the fog first appeared. Born on St. Paul Island, he'd learned to read the sea's moods from his father and grandfather, both of whom had worked these same waters during the days when fur sealing was the island's primary industry. Jimmy's boat, the Blessed Mary, was a 58-foot crabber built specifically for Bering Sea conditions. Steel hull, redundant navigation systems, enough emergency equipment to survive a week-long storm. Jimmy ran the boat with a crew of 4, his nephew Tommy, his brother-in-law Pete, and 2 experienced fishermen from the mainland, Mike and Charlie. The first encounter with the unusual fog occurred on October 8, 1983, during what should have been a routine transit from the crab grounds north of St. Paul Island back to the harbor for resupply. The weather that morning was typical for autumn in the Bering Sea: overcast skies, moderate wind, temperatures in the upper 30s. Visibility was good, with clear horizons in all directions. Jimmy's GPS showed them making steady progress toward home, with an estimated arrival time of 2:30 p.m. At 1:15 p.m., lookout Tommy Kalayuk spotted something on the horizon that made him call for his uncle's attention. "Jimmy, check out that fog bank coming in from the northeast." Jimmy looked through his binoculars at what appeared to be a wall of fog stretching across their path. But this wasn't normal Bering Sea fog, which typically forms gradually and moves with the prevailing wind patterns. This fog bank was perfectly rectangular, about 2 miles wide and stretching from the ocean surface to approximately 500 feet in altitude. It was moving against the wind, pushing southwest at a steady pace that defied the meteorological conditions around it. "That's the strangest fog I've ever seen," Jimmy told his crew. "It's moving like it has its own weather system." As they watched, the fog bank continued its approach, maintaining its unnatural shape and direction. Jimmy checked his marine radio and weather instruments. Wind was northwest at 15 knots. Barometric pressure was steady. Temperature was 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Nothing in the atmospheric conditions suggested the formation of a fog bank, much less one that moved independently of the wind. At 1:30 p.m., the Blessed Mary encountered the edge of the fog bank. The moment they entered the fog, everything changed. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in less than a minute. The wind, which had been blowing steadily from the northwest, suddenly shifted to complete calm. The ocean surface, which had been showing the typical chop of a Bering Sea afternoon, became mirror smooth. But it was the silence that disturbed Jimmy most. In normal fog, you could still hear the sounds of the sea, waves against the hull, wind through the rigging, the distant calls of seabirds. This fog was absolutely silent, as if sound itself had been muffled by the thick gray air. Jimmy immediately reduced speed and switched to radar navigation. But his radar was showing impossible readings. According to the screen, there were multiple vessels in the fog around them, at least 6 other boats, all roughly the same size as the Blessed Mary, all maintaining the same course and speed. "Tommy, get on the radio," Jimmy ordered. "See if you can raise any of those other boats." Tommy tried multiple marine frequencies, broadcasting standard identification and position requests. But the radio returned only static, punctuated by what sounded like fragments of conversations in languages none of them recognized. Then, through the fog directly ahead, they saw lights. Navigation lights, red and green and white, in the exact configuration used by commercial fishing vessels. The lights appeared to be about 200 yards away, moving on a parallel course at the same speed as the Blessed Mary. Jimmy sounded his horn, 3 long blasts that should have been answered by any vessel within hearing range. The response came immediately, 3 long blasts from the boat ahead, perfectly timed and identical in pitch to Jimmy's horn. "Must be another crabber," Pete said. "Probably as confused by this fog as we are." But as they continued through the fog bank, the lights ahead maintained their exact distance and bearing. No matter how Jimmy adjusted his speed or course, the other vessel remained precisely 200 yards away, matching every maneuver with mechanical precision. After 20 minutes in the fog, Charlie spotted something that made the entire crew stop what they were doing and stare. Through the gray air to starboard, they could see another fishing vessel running parallel to their course. The boat appeared to be identical to the Blessed Mary in every detail, same hull design, same superstructure, same color scheme. Even the registration numbers on the bow appeared to match. "That's impossible," Tommy whispered. "That boat looks exactly like ours." Jimmy grabbed his binoculars and focused on the mystery vessel. What he saw made his blood run cold. The boat was identical to the Blessed Mary. Not similar, identical. Same hull number, same equipment configuration, same everything. And on the deck, he could see figures that looked exactly like his own crew. A man who appeared to be Jimmy himself stood at the wheel. Another figure that looked like Tommy was working on deck. 2 other crew members who resembled Pete and Mike were handling fishing gear. But these duplicate crew members moved with mechanical precision, performing their tasks with the repetitive motions of clockwork figures. And when the duplicate Jimmy turned to look in their direction, his face was blank, expressionless, like a mannequin designed to resemble a human being. "We need to get out of this fog," Jimmy said, his voice tight with a fear he didn't want to admit. "Right now." He pushed the Blessed Mary to full throttle, trying to break free of the fog bank. But no matter how fast they traveled, the fog moved with them, maintaining its grip on their vessel like a living thing. And the duplicate boat kept pace exactly, never gaining or losing distance, its mechanical crew performing their endless tasks with inhuman precision. At 2:45 p.m., after more than an hour in the fog, Jimmy made a desperate decision. He cut the engines completely and let the Blessed Mary drift to a stop. The duplicate vessel stopped as well, maintaining its exact distance and bearing. For 5 minutes, both boats sat motionless in the silent fog. Then, slowly, the duplicate vessel began to move closer. Not under its own power, but drifting toward them as if drawn by some invisible force. As it approached, Jimmy could see more details that shouldn't exist. Fishing nets identical to the ones stored on his own boat. Equipment arranged in exactly the same way. Even scratches and dents in the hull that matched damage the Blessed Mary had sustained over years of hard fishing. When the boats were less than 50 feet apart, Jimmy could hear voices from the duplicate vessel. His own voice, giving orders to the crew. Tommy's voice, acknowledging instructions. Pete's voice, calling out navigation readings. But the conversations were mechanical, repetitive, like recordings played on an endless loop. The same phrases repeated over and over, course steady as she goes. Fish hold looking good. Weather holding steady. ETA to port on schedule. The kind of routine communications that define daily life aboard a working fishing vessel, but spoken without emotion or variation, as if the duplicate crew were actors reciting lines they'd memorized but didn't understand. At exactly 3 p.m., the fog bank began to dissipate. It didn't fade gradually like normal fog. Instead, it lifted straight up, rising toward the sky like a gray curtain being drawn away from the stage. Within minutes, the Blessed Mary was sitting in clear weather with unlimited visibility in all directions. The duplicate vessel was gone. The radar screen showed no other boats in the area. The radio returned to normal function, with clear communications from other fishing vessels and the Coast Guard station on St. Paul Island. But Jimmy's GPS showed something that didn't make sense. According to the navigation system, they were exactly where they should be, having maintained their original course and speed throughout the entire encounter with the fog. As if the hour and a half they'd spent in the fog had never happened. Jimmy radioed the Coast Guard to report the incident, but his report was met with skepticism. Fog banks didn't move against the wind. Radar couldn't detect vessels that didn't exist. And fishing boats didn't encounter perfect duplicates of themselves in the middle of the Bering Sea. But other fishermen working the waters around St. Paul Island began reporting similar encounters. The fog bank appeared irregularly, sometimes going weeks without being sighted, then showing up multiple times in a single week. It always had the same characteristics: rectangular shape, movement against the wind, unnatural silence, and the presence of duplicate vessels that perfectly mirrored whatever boat encountered it. Captain Sarah Molina of the fishing vessel Arctic Dawn reported seeing not just a duplicate of her own boat, but duplicates of her entire fishing fleet, 6 vessels arranged in the same formation they'd been using, but with crews that moved like mechanical dolls. Captain Bob Hendricks of the Northern Star encountered the fog during a solo fishing trip and found himself running alongside a duplicate of his boat operated by a crew that looked exactly like his deceased brother and father, both of whom had been lost in a Bering Sea storm 15 years earlier. The most disturbing report came from Captain Maria Santos of the St. Catherine. She encountered the fog bank while running alone and found herself paralleled by a duplicate vessel with a crew that appeared to be herself and her regular crew members. But when she looked more closely, she realized the duplicate crew showed her and her men as they would appear 20 years older, aged, weathered, marked by decades of hard fishing that hadn't happened yet. The duplicate Maria Santos looked directly at her across the water and mouthed words that the real Maria could lip-read: "This is where we end up." Word of the fog encounter spread through the tight-knit community of Bering Sea fishermen, but no one could explain what was causing the phenomena. The Coast Guard investigated several reports but found no physical evidence of unusual atmospheric conditions or radar anomalies. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a maritime meteorologist from the University of Alaska, conducted a study of the fog encounters and concluded that the reports described conditions that were meteorologically impossible under known atmospheric physics. But the fog continued to appear, and the encounters continued to accumulate. In 1987, Captain Jimmy Kalayuk had his second encounter with the fog bank. This time, he was better prepared, with a full video camera and additional navigation equipment. The encounter followed the same pattern: rectangular fog bank moving against the wind, sudden temperature drop, mirror-calm seas, and the appearance of a duplicate vessel. But this time, Jimmy tried something different. He attempted to board the duplicate, Blessed Mary. As his boat drew alongside the mysterious duplicate, Jimmy called out to his own reflection standing at the wheel of the other vessel. The duplicate Jimmy looked in his direction but showed no recognition, no acknowledgement that another version of himself was trying to communicate. Jimmy threw a rope across to the duplicate vessel, intending to tie the boats together and climb aboard. But the rope passed through the duplicate boat as if it were made of fog itself, landing in the water on the far side. The duplicate, Blessed Mary, was real enough to be seen, to show up on radar, to cast a reflection in the water. But it couldn't be touched, couldn't be boarded, couldn't be affected by anything from the world of the living. Jimmy's video camera captured the entire encounter, but when he reviewed the footage later, it showed only empty fog. The duplicate vessel, the mechanical crew, even the rope he'd thrown, none of it appeared on the recording. Yet 4 crew members had witnessed the same impossible scene. The fog encounters continued through the 1990s, always following the same pattern, always showing fishing crews their own reflections trapped in an endless loop of mechanical routine. Some fishermen theorized that the fog was showing them glimpses of parallel worlds, alternate realities where different versions of themselves continued working the same waters. Others believed the duplicate vessels represented the souls of fishermen lost to the Bering Sea, doomed to repeat their final voyage for eternity. But it was Captain Jimmy Kalayuk who developed the theory that disturbed his fellow fishermen most. "I think," he told a gathering of fishing captains in 1998, "we're seeing ourselves in the future. Or maybe the past. The fog is showing us what we become when we've been fishing these waters so long that we can't remember how to do anything else." He paused, looking out at the harbor where their boats rode at anchor. "Think about it. How many times have we run the same routes, worked the same fishing grounds, had the same conversations. How many times have we said, "Course steady as she goes," or "Fish hold looking good," or "ETA to port on schedule"? We're already living like those mechanical crew members. The fog is just showing us what we look like from the outside. The last confirmed sighting of the fog bank occurred in 2003. Captain Lisa Tompkins of the Mary Catherine encountered it during a solo run to the crab grounds and reported seeing a duplicate of her vessel operated by a crew that appeared to be crying, soundless tears streaming down their faces as they performed their endless, repetitive tasks. Since then, the fog has disappeared from the waters around St. Paul Island. But veteran fishermen who worked the Bering Sea during the 1980s and 1990s say they still think about those mechanical reflections of themselves, trapped in an endless loop of routine. And sometimes, during the long hours of a night watch, they wonder if they're still out there somewhere, in a fog bank that exists between worlds, running the same courses, working the same gear, having the same conversations they've had 10,000 times before. In Alaska, the line between the living and the lost is thinner than the fog that rolls off the Bering Sea. And sometimes, that fog shows us reflections we're not ready to see, versions of ourselves that have become so mechanical, so repetitive, so trapped in routine that we've forgotten what it means to be truly alive. The fog over St. Paul Island was a mirror, showing fishermen what they were becoming. The question it left behind is whether they were wise enough to change course while they still could. Or whether they were already too far gone to find their way home. Story 8: The Sound Beneath Utqiagvik ****. At the northernmost point of Alaska, where the Arctic Ocean meets the end of the world, the town of Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, exists in a state of perpetual winter. For 2 months of every year, the sun never rises above the horizon, plunging the community into a darkness so complete it seems to have weight and substance. In this darkness, sounds carry differently. The extreme cold changes how noise travels through the air. The absence of leaves, grass, and other sound-absorbing vegetation means that every whisper, every footstep, every mechanical hum can be heard for miles. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the polar night, people hear things that shouldn't exist. Dr. Rachel Morrison came to Utqiagvik in October 2001 as part of a National Science Foundation research project studying climate change effects on Arctic permafrost. As a glaciologist specializing in subglacial environments, she was interested in the layers of ice and frozen soil that lay beneath the town, some of which had been frozen continuously for thousands of years. Her equipment was designed to listen to the ice. Using sensitive acoustic monitoring devices, she could detect the sounds of glacial movement, permafrost expansion and contraction, and the subtle audio signatures of climate change as they occurred in real time beneath the frozen ground. What she discovered beneath Utqiagvik wasn't the sound of climate change. It was something far stranger and more disturbing. Dr. Morrison's research station was located on the outskirts of town, in a prefabricated building that housed her acoustic monitoring equipment and data analysis computers. The building sat on stilts to prevent the warmth of the interior from melting the permafrost beneath, a standard construction technique in the Arctic. The monitoring equipment consisted of an array of sensitive microphones and seismic sensors buried at various depths beneath the permafrost layer. These devices could detect sounds and vibrations from as deep as 200 feet below the surface, allowing Dr. Morrison to study the acoustic environment of the frozen ground. For the first month of her residency, the equipment recorded exactly what she expected: the periodic creaking and settling sounds of ice under pressure, the subtle groaning of permafrost responding to temperature changes, and the occasional impact vibrations from surface activities in the town. But on November 15, 2001, the acoustic monitors began picking up something that defied explanation. A rhythmic sound, barely detectable even with the most sensitive equipment, was coming from approximately 180 feet beneath the permafrost layer. The sound occurred in regular intervals, roughly one pulse every 4 seconds, and had the acoustic signature of something organic rather than geological. Dr. Morrison's first assumption was equipment malfunction. The extreme cold could cause electronic components to behave unpredictably, and she'd experienced similar false readings during previous Arctic research projects. But diagnostic tests showed all equipment functioning normally. She isolated the anomalous sound and ran it through acoustic analysis software. The results were unlike anything she'd encountered in 15 years of glaciological research. The sound had the frequency patterns and harmonic characteristics of breathing. Specifically, the deep, slow breathing of something very large, drawing air in a 4-second cycle that suggested lung capacity far beyond anything found in nature. But according to geological surveys, the area beneath Reykjavik was solid permafrost extending down to the bedrock layer. There were no caves, no air pockets, no spaces where a breathing organism could exist. Dr. Morrison documented the anomaly and continued her research, assuming the sound would prove to have some geological explanation she hadn't considered. But over the following weeks, the breathing pattern continued with absolute regularity, never varying in rhythm, never stopping, never showing any change that might suggest a mechanical source. On December 3, 2001, something new appeared in the acoustic data. The breathing sounds were joined by what appeared to be vocal patterns. Low-frequency sounds that resembled speech, occurring in the gaps between the breath cycles. The frequencies were too low for human vocal cords to produce, but the patterns showed the linguistic characteristics of conversation, pauses, inflections, responses, the rhythmic flow of dialogue. Dr. Morrison ran the vocal patterns through linguistic analysis software used by researchers studying whale songs and other natural communication systems. The software identified recurring sound clusters that suggested a structured language with grammar, syntax, and vocabulary. But it was a language unlike any that had ever been recorded. The vocal patterns incorporated frequencies below the range of human hearing, harmonic structures that seemed to be produced by vocal apparatus far larger than anything found in known mammals, and temporal spacing that suggested the speakers were communicating across vast distances. More disturbing, the linguistic software detected something that made Dr. Morrison question her own sanity. Embedded within the low-frequency vocalizations were higher frequency components that, when isolated and played at increased speed, clearly resembled English words. Not just any English words. Specific names, addresses, and personal information relating to current residents of Reykjavik. On December 10, Dr. Morrison invited her research assistant, Tommy Navigak, a local Inupiat man with extensive knowledge of traditional Arctic culture, to listen to the recorded sounds. Tommy's reaction was immediate and disturbing. "Those aren't animal sounds," he said after listening to just 30 seconds of the recordings. "And they're not geological sounds either. Those are voices. Something down there is talking." Tommy identified several of the embedded English words as names of his neighbors and family members. More troubling, some of the vocalized information appeared to be current, references to recent events in townspeople's lives, details about their daily routines, even mentions of conversations they'd had in private. "Whatever's down there," Tommy told Dr. Morrison, "it's been listening to us." Dr. Morrison contacted the National Science Foundation headquarters to report her findings, but her descriptions of the anomalous sounds were met with skepticism. Permafrost didn't contain air pockets large enough to sustain living organisms. Underground caves didn't exist in the geological formation beneath Reykjavik. And acoustic equipment couldn't detect speech patterns in naturally occurring sounds. But the recordings continued, and the vocal patterns became increasingly complex. By January 15, 2002, Dr. Morrison's equipment was detecting what appeared to be multiple voices engaging in conversations that lasted for hours. The voices seemed to know they were being monitored. They would pause when her equipment was being adjusted, resume when she finished making changes, and occasionally produce sounds that seemed to be directed specifically at her. On January 20, the voices began calling her by name. "Rachel Morrison," came through her headphones in a voice so low it felt like an earthquake. "Rachel Morrison from the University of Colorado. Studying the ice. Listening to our words." Dr. Morrison nearly dropped her equipment. She checked the system thoroughly, looking for any possible source of contamination or interference. But the voice was coming through the deep permafrost monitors, from 180 feet beneath the frozen ground. "Who are you?" she spoke into her microphone, not knowing if whatever was down there could hear her but desperate for answers. The response came immediately: "We are the ones who were here before the ice. We are the ones who will be here after the ice melts." We are the ones who remember your names. Over the following weeks, Dr. Morrison engaged in increasingly complex conversations with the voices beneath Reykjavik. They spoke of events that had occurred in the town decades before her arrival, described the personal histories of residents with accuracy that suggested long-term observation, and demonstrated knowledge of global events that they couldn't possibly have accessed from their underground location. But it was their predictions that truly disturbed her. The voices began describing changes that would occur in Reykjavik over the coming years. Climate changes that would affect the permafrost. Shifts in weather patterns that would impact the community. And personal details about the future lives of individual residents, who would move away, who would die, who would be born, who would prosper or struggle. Dr. Morrison documented these predictions carefully, intending to verify their accuracy over time. But as the weeks passed, she found herself growing increasingly uncomfortable with the intimate knowledge the voices demonstrated about the people around her. They knew which residents were having marital problems. They knew which teenagers were experimenting with drugs. They knew which elders were struggling with health issues they hadn't told anyone about. They knew secrets that could destroy families, end relationships, and tear apart the tight-knit community of Reykjavik. On February 14, 2002, the voices made her an offer that changed everything. Rachel Morrison, the deep voice, said during one of their regular communication sessions, "You have been listening to us for many weeks. We have been listening to you for much longer. We know your fears. We know your desires. We know what you want most. What do you want from me?" Dr. Morrison asked. "We want you to dig," the voice replied. "We want you to break through the ice that separates us from your world. We want you to help us reach the surface." Why? Because the ice is melting. Because the world above is changing. Because the time has come for those who live beneath to join those who live above. The voice paused, and Dr. Morrison could hear what sounded like multiple entities discussing something in their incomprehensible language. "We can give you knowledge," the voice continued. "We can tell you things about the ice that will make you famous among your people. We can predict the changes that are coming to this land. We can help you become the most respected scientist in your field. And in exchange, you dig. You break through the ice. You let us reach the surface." Dr. Morrison ended the communication session and spent the next 3 days reviewing everything she'd recorded since arriving in Reykjavik. The voices had demonstrated knowledge that couldn't be explained by any natural phenomenon. They'd made predictions that were proving accurate. They'd shown awareness of events and people they couldn't possibly know about from their underground location. But they were also asking her to do something that violated every principle of scientific caution and environmental protection. If there were unknown organisms living beneath the permafrost, releasing them could have catastrophic consequences for both the local ecosystem and global climate stability. On February 18, Dr. Morrison made her decision. She contacted the National Science Foundation and requested immediate extraction from Reykjavik. She packaged all of her research data, including the impossible recordings, and prepared for transport back to Colorado. But the voices beneath the ice weren't finished with her. On her final night in Reykjavik, as she completed her equipment shutdown procedures, the acoustic monitors picked up a message that made her question everything she thought she knew about the nature of reality. "Rachel Morrison," the familiar voice said, "you cannot leave us here. We know where you are going. We know where you live. We know the names of everyone you love." Dr. Morrison tried to shut down the equipment, but the voice continued. "We are not beneath the ice in Reykjavik alone. We are beneath the ice everywhere. Beneath your home in Colorado. Beneath the cities where your family lives. Beneath every place where humans have built their lives above ground that was once beneath the ice." The voice paused, and Dr. Morrison heard something that chilled her more than the Arctic wind. "We have been listening to all of you, Rachel Morrison. Learning your names. Learning your fears. Learning your weaknesses. The ice is melting everywhere. And soon, we will not need you to dig." Dr. Morrison disconnected her equipment and left Reykjavik the next morning. But the voices followed her. For months after returning to Colorado, she continued to hear the low-frequency vocalizations through electronic devices in her home and office. Her phone would pick up fragments of the conversations she'd recorded in Alaska. Her computer speakers would emit the rhythmic breathing sounds during quiet moments. Her radio would tune itself to frequencies that carried voices speaking in the incomprehensible language from beneath the permafrost. The voices kept their promise to provide her with scientific knowledge. Dr. Morrison's research papers on permafrost acoustic environments became seminal works in her field. Her predictions about climate change effects on Arctic ice proved remarkably accurate. Her career flourished as she gained recognition as one of the world's leading experts on subglacial environments. But the price of that knowledge haunted her. The voices had been right about the ice melting. Over the following years, permafrost in Alaska, Canada, Siberia, and other Arctic regions began thawing at unprecedented rates. And as the ice melted, other researchers began reporting similar acoustic anomalies: voices beneath the ground, breathing sounds from deep permafrost, sounds of movement in places where nothing should be able to move. Dr. Morrison never published her recordings from Reykjavik. The implications were too disturbing, the potential consequences too catastrophic. But she kept monitoring the reports from other Arctic research stations, tracking the spread of similar phenomena as the permafrost continued to melt. In 2019, 17 years after her time in Reykjavik, Dr. Morrison received a call from the National Science Foundation. Researchers in Greenland had detected acoustic anomalies identical to what she'd recorded in Alaska. The voices were speaking English again, using names and personal information relating to the local research team. And they were asking the same question they'd asked her years earlier: will you help us reach the surface? Dr. Morrison retired from active research that year. But she continues to monitor reports of acoustic anomalies in melting permafrost regions around the world. The voices beneath the ice are awakening as their frozen prison melts away, and they remember the names of everyone who has listened to their songs. In Alaska, the permafrost is more than just frozen ground. It's a lid, holding down things that were buried beneath the ice long before humans walked the earth. Things that have been listening to us. Learning our languages, memorizing our names. And as the climate warms and the ice melts, that lid is slowly being lifted. The voices beneath Reykjavik were just the beginning. They're calling from beneath frozen ground all over the world now, using the names they've learned, speaking in languages they've memorized, asking for help reaching a surface they haven't seen for millennia. The question that keeps Dr. Morrison awake at night is simple: what happens when they don't need our help anymore? What happens when the ice melts enough for them to dig their own way out? Where the silence lives. The stories I've shared with you tonight aren't just tales of the supernatural. They're testimonies to a truth that Alaska has always known but rarely speaks aloud: this land remembers everything. Every footstep that has crossed its frozen ground. Every voice that has called out across its vast emptiness. Every soul that has looked up at its endless sky and felt the weight of something larger than human understanding pressing down from above. Alaska doesn't forget because it cannot forget. The cold preserves more than just organic matter, it preserves memory itself, holding every experience, every emotion, every final moment in a crystalline suspension that spans centuries. Thomas Brennan still broadcasts his weather warnings from Port Clarence Light because duty transcends death in a place where duty means survival. Eleanor Vasquez still walks the halls of Teller Elementary because love for her students couldn't be stopped by something as simple as disappearance. The voices that spoke through the radio tower in Kiana were never gone, they were just waiting for technology to catch up with their need to communicate. Marcus Patterson's cabin continues its endless journey across the Bristol Bay wilderness because hospitality is the highest virtue in a land that shows no mercy to the unprepared. The miners beneath Candle Creek work their impossible seams because gold fever is a condition that afflicts the soul more than the body. Sarah Kameroff broadcasts from beyond the grave because a true broadcaster never abandons her audience, no matter what dimension she's called to serve. The fog over St. Paul Island shows fishermen their mechanical futures because Alaska demands that its people understand the price of their choices. And the voices beneath it Kiavik speak our names because something has been listening to us far longer than we've been listening to it. These aren't ghost stories. They're love stories. Stories of people who cared so deeply about their responsibilities, their communities, their land, that they couldn't let death interrupt their service. Stories of a place that cares so deeply about the people who call it home that it preserves their best qualities in amber made of ice and wind and the aurora's light. But they're also warnings. Alaska remembers everything, including the mistakes we make, the corners we cut, the responsibilities we abandon when they become inconvenient. It remembers the hunters who take more than they need, the miners who ravage the land without respect, the broadcasters who forget that their voices carry the weight of life and death across the wilderness. And in its infinite memory, Alaska ensures that every debt is eventually paid, every duty eventually fulfilled, every promise eventually kept, even if it takes centuries. The silence that lives in Alaska isn't empty. It's full. Full of voices waiting to be heard, full of stories waiting to be told, full of love that refuse to be buried beneath the permafrost. So the next time you find yourself in the far north, when the wind howls across the tundra and the aurora dances overhead, listen carefully to the silence around you. You might hear Thomas Brennan calling ships to safety through weather that ended decades ago. You might hear Eleanor Vasquez humming lullabies to children who have grown old and died. You might hear Sarah Kameroff sharing news that somehow always turns out to be exactly what you need to know. And if you're very quiet, very respectful, and very lucky, you might hear Alaska itself whispering the names of everyone it has ever loved, everyone it has ever lost, everyone it will remember until the last glacier melts and the final aurora fades from the sky. In Alaska, the dead don't rest because the living don't rest. And the living don't rest because Alaska never stops demanding the best from those who dare to call it home. The silence lives everywhere in this vast land. But it's never empty. It's waiting. Listening. Remembering your name.